Okay, so my name is Terry Conway, and I'm involved in Resistance Books, and I'm very pleased to be chairing this meeting tonight. Want to draw people's attention now to the fact that we have a bookstore over there, and in particular to the two books that Resistance Books and Merlin Press have published, which are relevant to tonight's meeting. So the first book is We the Indians, the indigenous peoples of Peru and the struggle for land, which is a book of Hugo's writings, which I had the great privilege of editing. I've met Hugo many, many years ago when he came to Britain in the 1980s, and then I met him again when he came here 8 years ago and did a tour, and out of that Resistance Books decided to publish this book, and working on it was a real joy and a real privilege. And we published that at the beginning of 2018, and then later in 2018 we published this book, Hugo Blanco, A Revolutionary Life, which is a biography of Hugo written by Derek Wall, who sadly isn't here with us tonight because he was speaking at a meeting in Manchester with Hugo yesterday and is speaking at meetings with him on Wednesday and Thursday, so he thought he'd better have a night at home, really. But again, I was heavily involved in working on the book and doing some editing with Derek, and again it was a real privilege, and I think these are two incredibly vivid books that really tell from different perspectives, one from Hugo's own perspective, one from Derek's perspective, the story of an extraordinary life, which Hugo will tell you about more lyrically and more powerfully than I can. But I would urge everybody to buy the books. And we're also going to be passing a contact list round during the meeting. So if you've not heard about our meetings before, we tend to organise a meeting like this once a month. And if you want to find out about that and want to find out more about what we do and think, then sign up on the contact list. So what we're going to do now is, in a minute, I'm going to introduce Jeff Weber, who's going to speak to us first, and then Hugo will be speaking in Spanish, so for those of us whose Spanish is not so good, Oscar's going to be translating. So Jeff will speak first for about 12 minutes, and then Hugo and Oscar together will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion from the floor. If there are people who want to ask questions in Spanish, I'm sure that Oscar can translate for the rest of us. So, Jeff.
Okay, hi everyone. First of all, it's obviously a tremendous honor and privilege to be speaking alongside Hugo Blanco tonight, and I'm very thankful for the invitation to participate. What I'm going to do, just very briefly in 12 minutes, is try to connect what I see as some of the guiding threads in the political ethos of Hugo Blanco over the course of his life, as depicted now in English for the first time in We the Indians, the book that Terry mentioned. And then I'm going to try to connect what I see as these principal underlying political ethos to the contemporary Latin American situation over the last decade or so, in very broad strokes. obviously without the presumption that Hugo is going to agree with my reading of this, but I see it as very much in the tradition of his basic political commitments. So in very broad strokes, one of the things that has stayed consistent in the politics of Hugo Blanco has been a commitment to and active participation in movements of and by the oppressed from below and to the left. Now, specific political positions have obviously evolved over the years, but I think that basic idea of the self-emancipation of the oppressed, that no one does this for them, is a red thread that ties all of the different epochs and particularities of his political commitments. In more recent decades, the fundamental commitment politically has been to a combination of indigenous liberation struggles, which is in some ways an extension of earlier land struggles, but framed in a more vociferously indigenous liberationist lens, and that tied intimately to questions of socio-ecological struggle and the contradiction between sustainable ecological modes of life and the various crises induced by capitalism. So, inside of those two broad threads, what kind of guide does this give us to understand and to intervene in contemporary Latin American developments? I think one of the major contradictions of the so-called pink tide, even at its height, the turn to the left, which, depending on how you periodize this, is basically from the late 90s, with the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998, his assumption to office in 1999, to more or less the beginning of the unraveling of the pink tide between 2012 and 2013, and its serious crisis at the moment with the rise of new rights. One of the major contradictions of many of the pink tide experience was the fact that left and center-left governments which came to office mainly in the mid-2000s, so Chavez preceded this wave by quite a bit, mainly in the mid-2000s, and corresponded with a Chinese-driven commodities boom, which accelerated the impulse of these new governments to intensify relations with multinational capital, to extract mining minerals, oil, natural gas, agro-industrial monocropping, and so on. And this allowed for the period of the commodities boom, which roughly spans 2003 to 2011, allows for these left governments to avoid a serious confrontation with capital in the sense of expropriation, even in the sense of prohibitive taxation in many ways. Taxation still remains very, very low in the countries in which the left ruled. But what it did allow, even with modest royalty and tax increases, was a skimming of the rent to redistribute that rent, so long as commodity prices were high, to redistributive programs, which was the basis, the material basis for the legitimacy of what were, in fact, quite modestly reformist governments. Obviously, there are many shades and distinctions to make between them, but in broad strokes, because I have 12 minutes, we'll make that basic point. Okay? And in this period, however, net profitability of capital, almost without exception, was higher in the mid-2000s than it was in the mid-1990s. That is the height of neoliberal governance in Latin America. So capital was not losing, although it had lost politically, it was not losing in terms of its basic reason to exist, which is profitability. Which isn't to say it loved these governments. It tried to destabilize them at the beginning when they were unpredictable, but it learned to live with them and it profited from them. At the same time, there were real livelihood gains, decreases in poverty, less so in terms of inequality, depending on how it's measured, but real gains in education, health, and so on. But this rested on two contradictions. One was the socio-ecological devastation of the intensification of extraction that was necessary, or that was deemed necessary, to propel this class compromise, in which capital continues to win, but livelihoods improve so long as commodity prices are high. This came at the cost of massive dispossession and the criminalization of dissent in those key strategic areas. And where this connects to the indigenous question is that these weren't just peasants always resisting, but peasants identified as indigenous peoples in many of the cases. And therefore left states, sometimes in the name of indigenous liberation, in the case of Morales in Bolivia, for example, came into confrontation with actual movements of indigenous self-determination on the ground, fighting to protect their territories from the intensification of resource extraction. So in broad terms, these were some of the contradictions. They were minimally sustainable during a period of commodities boom. The commodity boom ends, depending on which commodity is driving the economy, it's not precise, but between 2011 and 2014, depending on what you're looking at, whether it's mining minerals, soya, or oil, which crashes later. But all of this has to do with the slowdown of China as the key way in which the crisis reverberates back into Latin America. And that ability of having a class compromise in which capital continues to enjoy profits but livelihoods are improving disappears with the disappearance of that easy flow of state revenue. And that class question that these states were faced with but were able to delay suddenly comes to the foreground. And almost without exception, although with different varieties and forms of implementation, center-left and left governments make the political decision to transfer the cost of austerity onto their impoverished bases in an effort to show credibility to financial capital and to natural resource capital, with whom they have now become intimately entwined. This means that, on the one side, they lose very quickly the support of their social bases, who no longer are willing to mobilize in support of them when the right is emboldened. And on the other side, capital never saw as their natural home these left governments. And therefore, in a situation of declining profitability and economic crisis, they either move to new configurations of the right, or they return to old traditional rights where those were still available and electorally viable. And when they weren't electorally viable, then you saw the manipulation of elections, either through extra-constitutional forms of coming to office, Brazil 2016, Paraguay 2012, Honduras, a proper military coup in 2009, or you see electoral victories where it's possible to win electorally, or some combination of these, usually justified after the fact through some kind of legal manipulation or gesture towards elections. So what Hugo Blanco's vision, I think, does is to point us precisely to the heart of the unresolved socio-ecological crisis of capitalism, its internally colonial characteristics in focusing on the dispossession of indigenous peoples, and the problem with not confronting capital in a serious way through expropriation, redistribution, in other words, a transformation of the mode of production, means that the class question was simply delayed. And this has come roaring back. And the problem that we face is the extreme decline in the credibility of slogans like 21st century socialism and these kinds of things in the contemporary crisis, because these had been increasingly associated with disguised or explicit austerity measures by left or center-left states. So I'll just close with the situation in Venezuela, which is obviously the sharpest contradiction of the moment. This is obviously my opinion. I'm not claiming this is Hugo's opinion. My reading of this situation, from below and to the left, and with these contradictions in mind, is that obviously, I think it's obvious, if it's not, it's obvious to me, opposition to any and all form of imperial intervention is a priority, particularly for those of us living in imperial countries, such as the UK's locking up of $2 billion in Venezuelan gold finances to the Venezuelan state. At the same time, and not in contradiction with this, I think it's of fundamental importance to see the class character of the Maduro administration, not as one that is emancipatory and a social state, or even one closely approximating this, and also not reducing this to Maduro as a political personality, but locating the bureaucratic ossification of the Bolivarian process to the late period of Chavez. And to take this very, very seriously, without which you can't understand the economic crisis, which is not a product principally of imperialism, which is a product of regular, rentier Venezuelan capitalism, which was never transformed during the Bolivarian process. And if one sees that, then one can, over the medium term at least, think about the forms of renewing the left from below and to the left, and with indigenous liberation and socio-ecological liberation all wrapped up in one another. If one can't see that, particularly if one becomes nostalgic for the period of the center left and left, as if it isn't also imbricated in the crisis that we're in now, there is much less hope for a renewal of socialism and the credibility of socialism in the 21st century.
Thanks very much, Jeff, as usual, giving us lots to think about.